Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we are happy to have you with us. Very busy show for us today. I feel like I say that every day, but I do truly mean it. Connor Riley stops by. There's some interesting notes out there as relates to UGA recruiting. I want to make sure we touch on those. One of the big questions kind of is what's next for Georgia after an amazing run of offensive line commits of the last few days. Maybe now turning your attention to the defensive side of the ball. New information on that. We will give that to you during the program today. We now know who Georgia is taking with it to SEC Media Days. I think well served by the three gentlemen who will be speaking on behalf of the program. We'll tell you more about why here coming up in a couple of minutes. And I want to begin this way. I think Georgia fans have to kind of get used to something kind of weird happening around the program, and some of the teams competing with Georgia are the place you look and you sort of notice this. Ohio State, Ryan Day, still whining about losing to the Peach Bowl. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you have to have the proper perspective on this. So I'm going to try to share with you what my perspective is, and we'll see if we can form some agreement on this today. I think it'll be a fun conversation. We're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
A lot of you know I've grown up here in the state of Georgia, kind of in the Atlanta area. I grew up in Hall County. That was kind of the country back when I was growing up there. It's a little bit more of a, sort of a suburb now. It's just kind of amazing how the Atlanta growth has sort of turned what used to be sort of the country into sort of a suburb, but that's kind of what that is there in Hall County where I grew up. And obviously grew up a huge Georgia fan. But in addition to that, I liked all the local teams. Fan of the professional sports teams from Atlanta. Big Braves fan now, of course, and, was back then there too. But I also liked the Atlanta Hawks back then. I'm not a huge NBA fan as much anymore. Still kind of follow the league a little bit. But when I was a kid, I was a big Hawks fan. In the 80s, that's when I was a child. That's when Dominique Wilkins was there. Big fan of the Atlanta Hawks. And it's kind of weird, if we admit something here, the Hawks have never quite had the same level of prestige or accomplishment some other NBA franchises have. In recent years, they have, I guess, been to the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of times. So you might even say the Atlanta portion of that franchise's history, those are the top moments in the history of the franchise since it's been in Atlanta. But when I was a kid, they didn't have that. They had not been to the Eastern Conference Finals in Atlanta, I don't guess. And really, the best moment in the franchise might have been a loss in the 1988 playoffs, Game 7 to Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics. And as weird as that sounds, that was kind of like the thing that everybody sort of remembered about the Hawks the time they almost beat the Celtics. That a loss was actually a fond memory, even so much so that you want to go back 20 years or so ago. This is sort of like maybe pre-YouTube being as big and popular as it is now. There used to be a show on the NBA Network, NBA TV, called Hardwood Classics. They would show old games, and every time they would show like that Celtics-Hawks series from 1988, I'd almost always watch it because it's one of those weird things where even though Atlanta lost the series, it still was like an almost win. They could have won it. They were almost relevant. It's like kind of one of those things that you sort of looked back on fondly, even though it was actually kind of a bad moment for your team. And I guess that's my purpose for saying all of that, that as a sports fan, you're a sports fan too, we kind of understand this together, that sometimes in sports, a bad moment can actually be a good memory. As I said before, Hawks lost to the Celtics, but this is Dominique Wilkins on the biggest stage, kind of putting Atlanta on the map against the very relevant Boston Celtics. And Atlanta, by almost winning that series, almost became relevant. And as sort of funny and silly as it is to say, that's about as close as we had to anything worth cheering for back then for that particular team. And really at that time, and in Atlanta sports kind of in general, we just didn't have a lot of success. So Atlanta almost beating the Celtics was as bad as good as we had. It was a bad moment, lost the series, but it's kind of a good memory because it was as close to success as we probably got during that tenure of Atlanta professional sports history back in the 1980s. And all of that is sort of a setup for this, that if you're a Georgia fan right now, you've got to understand that a lot of the sports fans around you, college football fans around you, they sort of view their favorite team in kind of the same fashion. And maybe if you're like me and you grew up, as an Atlanta sports fan here in the state of Georgia, where you were sort of hoping yourself to be relevant, now that you're a fan of the Georgia Bulldogs, the two-time reigning national champs, the favorites to win a third, all of a sudden now you've enjoyed and sort of conquered a level of relevance that the rest of college football can only be jealous of, that you have to sort of see the world sometimes from the way they view things, and it's going to be a little bit confusing. And what you have to realize is that sometimes, much the same way back when I was a kid, just being close to the Boston Celtics was kind of a big deal. There is a certain stripe of college football fan, maybe even college football program, that's going to view just being close to Georgia is kind of a big deal. That it's actually a good memory, even though it was a bad outcome for them. They may have lost a game, but just being close to Georgia is the kind of thing that maybe one day they'll sort of tell their kids about. And I'm not trying to say this in like a snarky, sarcastic way. I'm actually being as straightforward as I guess I'm capable of being. Like, if you're a Missouri fan, and you happen to be in Como this past fall for that game in which Missouri almost beat Georgia, if you're a Missouri fan, is that a good memory or a bad memory? For most Missouri fans, I'm guessing it's probably a good memory. The environment was loud. It was rocking. A lot of good things happen. It's exciting. It's about as close to success as Missouri's ever going to come, at least in this day and age. And even though it was heartbreaking at the end for Tigers fans, they lost the game, I'm guessing a lot of Missouri fans are like, hey, we kept it close against Georgia. High five. That's more than we thought we were probably capable of doing. And maybe that's somewhat easy to understand when it's a Missouri who's doing that. But believe it or not, that same mindset might exist for teams who are a little higher up the food chain than that. Like, a lot of us think of Ohio State as a power. This is a team that's traditionally in the top 2 or 3 of recruiting. They are traditionally in the top 2 or 3 of the preseason rankings, even if they kind of disappoint and fall short of those aspirations during the year. This is a team that's mentioned frequently among college football's blue bloods. They have won a national championship in the college football playoff era back in 2014. This is a team that we sort of think of on a stature similar to Georgia. And yet, Ohio State has also lost to Michigan the last couple of years. They seemingly have had a hard time living up to the expectations the fans have for the program. And prior to this year's college football playoff, there was a little bit of a negative vibe around the Buckeyes here a little bit. And the game against Georgia, in which Ohio State played it close, all of a sudden, that seems to be one of those things that Ohio State fans seem to want to relive as much as they possibly can. And for fans, you would certainly understand that being the case. But what's also been a little bit weird is that Ohio State coach Ryan Day has seemingly also taken on the same mindset mentality of a fan, in that he seems to want to go back and relive the Peach Bowl over and over and over again, even though that's a game that his team lost. And as many of you are aware, Day's way of doing this is by going back and kind of, re-traumatizing himself about the play late in the game in which Javon Bullard made a good defensive play in the back of the end zone against Marvin Harrison Jr. We hate the fact that Harrison got injured on that. You never want to see that. And, no player get hurt at any point in time. But Bullard's got nothing to apologize for. He's just playing good football. He's trying to separate a receiver from the football. That's what physical football teams do. Bullard, obviously, a very physical player. But Harrison Jr. did get hurt on that. Day, who's the old line that Jim Harbaugh made famous about being born on third base and thinking he hit a triple. Day, who's been given everything that his career's ever had, gifted a job at Ohio State, done very little with that, gifted everything that he's ever had, apparently expected to be gifted something by the officials too, a targeting call that could keep that drive alive for the Buckeyes. Ultimately, he didn't get it, and as many of you know, he has been whining about it throughout the entirety of the offseason, including recently on an interview that I was made aware of. Many of you shared this with me. It's kind of funny. Sometimes we're all on kind of the same wavelength here. Day recently with the college football analyst Joel Klatt. Now, Klatt's the one who asks him the question here, so it's not like Day brings this up unsolicited, but at the same time, Day also seems to be more than happy to talk about this particular subject, the idea that the call on the field was targeting, and eventually that was overturned by the instant replay process. And Ryan Day's point on all is that this just goes to show you what's wrong with the instant replay process, that it didn't uphold the targeting that he's sure he saw between Javon Bullard and Marvin Harrison Jr. It is amazing the fact that Day, after all of these many months, is still talking about this. This is what Ryan Day recently told Joel Klatt about that targeting call that he thinks should have taken place for Javon Bullard against Marvin Harrison Jr., and that dastardly instant replay process that took this away. Here is Ryan Day.
We're getting so much into the weeds on this that we've lost where we started on it. And what was the reason why we did this? To protect young men. Mm-hmm. And so, if someone's launching at somebody's head and they're unconscious on the ground, that's not what we want here. And so I think sometimes, we get into these slow motion things and we start to get so, caught up in the little details of everything. And it's not realistic sometimes watching it in slow motion. So I think there has to be some sort of a common sense. I think we have to still trust the referees on the field and what they see. They're there for a reason. And then if it's egregious, one way or the other, then that's where the instant replay comes into play. But I think right now what we've done is we've just put so much into the instant replay that what you see in a slow frame isn't really what's going on in the field. And we have to go back to the common sense and why the rules even put into place.
So I try not to be preachy on this show because I don't think people like that. But if I were going to be preachy, here's something I might say. That nothing sort of, I think, speaks to like modern times more so than Ryan Day, who's like, in my feelings, this is supposed to be targeting. My truth is this is supposed to be targeting. And the instant replay, when you actually go back and watch the instant replay, it actually demonstrates that it was a clean hit by Bullard. It was contact below the shoulder. It's just good football. Yet that doesn't align with my feelings, and my feelings need to be respected more so than the fact pattern here that what Javon Bullard actually did was a good football. And so therefore, since the instant replay demonstrates something that actually runs counter to my feelings, therefore we shouldn't have instant replay whatsoever. If I was going to be preachy, I might kind of point the hypocrisy out and all of that. Now, the truth is I'm not a huge fan of instant replay either. So, maybe in some respects, I guess Ryan Day and I aren't completely at odds on all of this. But there's just nothing that's sort of less, conduct, more sort of conduct unbecoming than the idea that Ryan Day is still sort of whining about this play between Bullard and Marvin Harrison Jr. and the fact that Day has now decided he hates instant replay because instant replay doesn't validate his feelings. That's just something very beta about all of that. I think most of us, I think, would probably agree. And it leads to a fairly, honest question of, how come Ryan Day is still doing this? After all these months, how come he is still harping on the same issue, the same play for a game that his team lost? How come he's not shaking that off and being willing to look to the future? And honestly, here's what I believe. I believe it's for the exact reasons that I described before. Ohio State losing to Georgia from the sort of textbook standpoint is sort of a bad thing, but in a weird way, I think that's actually a good memory for Ryan Day. I think he revisits this topic because I think he actually likes it. I think actually, and this is where if you're a Georgia fan, you've got to get acquainted with the current age in which we live in, that Ohio State fans actually think it was good their team played Georgia close, whereas we would assume that Ohio State fans would only be willing to tolerate a win. The truth is that Ohio State fans think of Georgia on such a high stature, the fact that Ohio State even kept it close with Georgia is something they actually kind of brag about. Hey, if it wasn't for this targeting call in their mind that they think should have taken place or whatever else, maybe we could have won the game. If our kicker hadn't kicked it sideways, maybe we could have won the game. And Ohio State fans, much like Hawks fans back in the 1980s, are all of a sudden bragging about a game in which they lost because this is as close as they're going to come to being relevant. And if you're Ryan Day, who's, nothing if not, sort of a, self-preservationist, much better to talk about almost beating Georgia than it is to talk about getting dragged by Michigan in consecutive years. And there's almost like a sort of a cynical strategy behind all of this of, if I can get people mad at the referees in the Peach Bowl, that takes the attention away from the fact that I've lost to Michigan these past 2 years. That Ryan Day is interested in revisiting this topic because I honestly think he must think it helps him to talk about how close Ohio State came to beating Georgia. And that is just a very weird world for a Georgia fan to live in. It is evidence of the fact that you have distanced yourself, or the team has distanced itself from the rest of college football so much that all of a sudden now Ohio State, who we think of as I mean, somewhat of an equal, right? And you think of Ohio State as sort of a fair fight. This is a team that plays in the same plane as Georgia does, yet they're still bragging about keeping it close against UGA. And Michigan, we grew up thinking about Michigan being one of the biggest brands in all of college football. They have the supposed beat Georgia period during practice because it is so aspirational in their mind to even be on the same field as Georgia that's like their example of sort of shooting for the moon during practice. These are very weird times that Georgia fans live in, that Georgia has conquered college football so much that the behavior of those who are trying to compete with Georgia has actually kind of gotten a little bit strange. Ohio State bragging about a game in which they lost or wanting to relive the moments in that game quite so much, I think sort of speaks to just how cool they think it was. They actually kept it close against a team that really no longer plays it close against anybody. Michigan, who we would have think of as one of the biggest programs all of college football, have been kind of reduced to hoping and dreaming and wishing to beat Georgia during practice. That if you're a Georgia fan, this is a little bit new, it's a little bit different, but it sort of speaks to where the Dogs are right now. And it also sort of speaks to the challenge that exists here in 2023. If you're Kirby Smart, if you're these Georgia players and you're everything else, sort of making sure you stay right there. The success that Georgia has had has made the programs competing with Georgia act very strange, very weird. And for a lot of us, this is pretty entertaining to see. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we are happy to have you with us no matter how. You get to us today live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We start even earlier than that, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, and on the DawgNation app, and of course on the radio at noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, as a podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just lots of ways for you to make the show a part of your life, and we just appreciate you picking one of those platforms and using it, and hopefully it works well for you. We're just really, really thankful that you're a part of what we're doing here, and we are so grateful to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia who make it all possible there as well. Good partners of ours, longtime friends. We love the support we have from them, and we are so grateful to help tell their story because we know the work they're doing for people out there in our audience. They've been trusted by UGA. They're proud partners of UGA. That means when you support Engineered Solutions of Georgia, you're also supporting a company that has supported the Dogs for a long time. And when it comes to taking good care of your home, Engineered Solutions of Georgia is a very important resource for you because one of the greatest threats to your home, threatening the structural integrity of that home, foundation waterproofing issues. You know the signs of this. The water stuff is easy to see, right? When it rains, water is where it's not supposed to be. Wet spots, garage, down in the basement. Sometimes that's even like a standing water type situation, crawl space. You know all of that. And the same thing is true for some of those cracks in the walls too. You see that sort of stair-step looking crack in the brick sometimes, or those sort of horizontal looking cracks in the sheetrock, something like that. Y'all, that is a sign that ought to be a trigger to you that, oh yeah, when I see this, BA said, Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Go ahead and make that call. And sometimes it's easy to want to put this off and not know what's going on, but nothing good comes from waiting. Nothing good comes from putting off what could be done right now. Because let's face it, Engineered Solutions of Georgia is a solutions-based company. That means if it's a simple fix, they'll be able to describe what you need to go out and do. Maybe it's a trip to the hardware store. One little thing can take care of what you need. But if it's more substantial work, all the more reason to have ESOG on the job because they have an entire team of engineers on staff to help you. That is what they are all about. They've also got an incredible, fully transferable triple protection warranty on materials, installation, and design there as well. So give them a call, 678-ESOG now. That is 678-ESOG now. Have a conversation with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia today. All right, fun conversation with us coming up with Connor Riley here in a couple of minutes. A lot to get to with him. A lot of it's going to center on UGA recruiting and some of the stuff that's gone on as of late and some of the stuff that may go on here over the course of the next couple of months. Really more like next few weeks, I guess. Probably the better way to say that. We'll do that with Connor Riley here coming up in a couple of minutes' time. Prior to that, let's go around the DawgHouse here today. And we got some information yesterday, which I guess is not unexpected. I feel like this would have – I think we made some guesses about who, it might be. I think I got 2 of the 3 right. Georgia's going to send 3 players, as every SEC team will, to SEC Media Days next week. And we know now for Georgia, Cedric Von Prawn Granger, Brock Bowers, and Kamari Lassiter are going to go. The two that I believe I got right were Bowers and SVP. I think those are the easiest to select. Laster I knew would be a candidate. I thought that Georgia might send a different defensive player, but they're sending Kamari Laster instead. And I think that Georgia has picked a very good trio here. I think all three of these guys will do a very effective job of being spokesmen for the program. I mean, SVP coming back, I think, has probably been the most under-discussed part of the offseason here thus far for Georgia, that this is a guy who could have gone to the NFL draft, as a center, probably wouldn't have been a first-round pick, but would he have been a very attractive draft prospect if he wanted to leave? I believe he possibly could have been. Coming back, I think he puts himself in the position to be among the very best centers in the country, and an anchor, once again, for an offensive line that I believe will be the very best in the entire country. Now, would Georgia have still been successful along the offensive line at SVP not come back? Odds are it probably would have been. They've got a good bit of program depth here, but it's just a very different story. If SVP had not come back, I think you can make a case that the second biggest on-field story for Georgia would be who the new center was going to be for 2023. Quarterback would have been the biggest story no matter what, probably. But just beyond that, I believe if SVP had not come back, breaking in a new center and the importance of that and that sort of center quarterback comfort, the way in which a center kind of becomes the focal point for the offensive line. If Van Pran was not coming back for Georgia, that's a conversation that rightly would have dominated much of the offseason. With him coming back, it's simply a matter of just continuing the continuity that you've enjoyed, and that's why the Georgia offensive line, I believe, is set up to be as good as it's going to be here this year. So good to have him here at SEC Media Days. Probably an easy assumption to make that he would be here. I think Brock Bowers, for me, is a little bit of a similar theme in that Bowers is one of the very best players in the entire country. Easy to assume that Georgia would want to take him. And when possible, I think every SEC team should do this. You get a choice of like who you send to SEC Media Days. And if you're attending Media Days as like a reporter from Louisiana or, Arkansas or somewhere like that, Bowers is the guy you want to talk to. And I do believe that SEC Media Days, when it can be, ought to be a platform and a springboard for these very good players to kind of get some more national attention. Now, there are some good players who do not like talking to me. They're very, very shy. It's just a miserable experience for them. And I'm not exactly looking to torture them, but making them come to SEC Media Days. But the event itself ought to be a platform for the very best players in the league. So from that standpoint, I think it's good that Georgia's sending Bowers. I think this ought to be a season in which, from a PR standpoint, Brock Bowers is introduced to the country in a way that he has not quite been as of yet. I still think, now, Bowers did win the Mackey Award a year ago, so after not even being a finalist for the award in 2021, I guess he's getting more attention now. But we believe that Brock's one of the very best players in the entire country. I think he could be a top 10 pick in the upcoming draft. I saw some the other day kind of compare him to Kyle Pitts. Pitts was a top 5 pick. So I think the positioning that Bowers could have in next year's NFL draft is really very high. And so therefore, this is a guy who ought to rightly be treated as one of the very best players in college football here this year. And it's going to take some more attention from the media on him to get that to be true, to get that story told correctly. And so having him at SEC Media Days, I think, is the right thing to do here. I'm glad he's going to be there. Kamari Laster is one of several defensive players that Georgia could have sent here. I think he's going to be a very good choice for Georgia. But beyond that, I think it also sends a little bit of a signal maybe to the rest of us of just how important Laster may be to this year's defense, that you're looking at Georgia kind of graduating some players to larger roles here this season. Laster was a starter for Georgia a year ago, but now he kind of becomes the cornerback who may have, to the extent this is, how Georgia chooses to play it, like the additional responsibility. The cornerback is sort of the leader of that group. The cornerback who, gets a chance to be sort of the lockdown guy for Georgia here this year. And frankly, one of those guys, and we say this all the time, that you got to have about a half dozen sort of first-team All-SEC type players. You've got to have, guys who are really kind of putting themselves at the forefront of the conversation of very best players in the SEC, very best players in the country. And that means at a place like Georgia at the beginning of the season, you have candidates looking to emerge. Well, there's no doubt in my mind now, it's been true for a while, and this just validates it, that Kamari Laster is one of those candidates that's really going to emerge on the scene for Georgia, assuming he can stay healthy, emerge for Georgia on the scene over the course of the season. And for the particular event of SEC Media Days. We also know that he's likely to be a very good spokesman for Georgia there as well because of some of the stuff he's said in the past, including, remember back in the spring when there was all this talk about Georgia, I guess, modeling itself after a famous rugby team and, kind of like the leadership lessons kind of taken from a successful team from a different sport and, kind of how Georgia can kind of adopt that themselves. And one of the phrases that Kirby Smart was using at the time was the idea of eating off the floor. And I think Kirby sort of meant that from a sort of a humble standpoint of, are you hungry enough to do whatever it takes? Are you hungry enough to eat off the floor? Or do you think you've kind of arrived and, you should be fed caviar and lobster and steak and things like that? And Kamari Laster also had his own explanation for what kind of Kirby meant when he sort of talked about a team mantra of eating off the floor. And it's words like this from Laster, one of the reasons why he was selected to be a part of SEC Media Days. This is what Kamari said.
Eating off the floor is just a mentality. Like you're not too big for anything. You're not too big to do the little things right. You're not too big to do the things that got you to where you are. So, just going in and approaching every day, like I said, like it's your last day, giving your best at every opportunity you have.
What's the motivation? And I know that Coach Smart is a master motivator, and last year he had a lot of you guys sold on apparently nobody thought you were going to be good or something he said, which couldn't be further from the truth, by the way. But now everybody thinks you're going to be good. You're going to be a preseason number one to make history as a three-peat. So where do you feel like the team has drawn some inspiration? Or is there still a chip on the shoulder? Or what do you think collectively the team is motivated by this offseason?
I think we're motivated by just, not getting complacent, not trying to stay stagnant. If we stay stagnant, then people will catch up to us. And then if people catch up to you, you're eventually going to get beat. And just to not wanting to lose, we at Georgia, we want to win every game. We want to win against everybody we play. So, just the will to win is what's keeping us going, is what's motivating us.
As everybody knows, they're kind of competing agendas at SEC Media Days. The media who's there, they want the players to say interesting things. Sometimes the coaches want the players to properly express the mantra for the upcoming season and kind of cast the right vision for how the team is expected to perform for the upcoming year. Obviously, that's why Kirby selects the players that he selects. And when you hear Kamari Laster speaking right there, it's fairly obvious that Laster seems to get the picture for what Georgia wants, what Georgia can accomplish this year, and the path that the program needs to travel in order to be able to get that done. That is Around the DawgHouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And before we are done on today's program, there are a couple of pretty interesting recruiting notes that I want to get to. In fact, there's a story out there that has nothing to do with UGA that seemingly has gotten some Georgia fans kind of thinking out loud a little bit about UGA recruiting. We'll tell you exactly why that is here coming up in just a moment. Also, a major Georgia recruiting target has gotten a little bit of a boost here as of late that once again, I guess, kind of reemphasizes exactly why the Dogs are chasing him as hard as they are right now. So there are a couple of major pieces of recruiting news to get to here before we're done on the program today, and we will do that. We will also laugh and have some fun at the expense of the lousy, stinking Gators because of a moment of not quite so glorious recent histories of the Florida Gators that once again kind of reemerged a little bit this week. We'll tell you more details about that coming up today there as well, and a very funny golden shoe on that topic here too. So we got a lot to do before we are all said and done, but for now, on everything happening around Georgia football, getting ready for SEC Media Days, looking back on quite a run for the program from a recruiting standpoint over the course of the last few days. Let's cover all of that ground and so much more with DawgNation's Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So, lots to talk to Connor Riley about. Did not get a chance to speak to Connor last week. He was enjoying some vacation. Glad to have him back here today. And, Connor, let me bring you in on where I just was. 3 Georgia players selected to attend SEC Media Days next week. Cedric Von Prawn, Kamari Laster, Brock Bowers. I'd gotten 2 of these 3 right with my prediction. Laster was a candidate, of course. I maybe thought they would take a different defensive player, but I think that Laster's a fine choice. What did you make of the 3 guys that Georgia selected? And I guess what do you see as any kind of theme or message about this trio?
Obviously, Cedric was here last year. He is the heartbeat of this team. He is, maybe not necessarily the loudest voice, but the voice that is most clearly heard by the members of this team. And, saying all that, what he brings from a leadership standpoint, he's also, in my opinion, the best center in the country, and that's incredibly valuable, and he's obviously going to represent Georgia incredibly well. Brock Bowers is the best player in the SEC, and while he is not the most engaging or entertaining interview, it's important for him to be at these sort of events and sort of represent Georgia, and he will do so, and will absolutely do so the right way. On the defensive side, I think you were right in the sense that there were a number of different ways they could have gone here. I think Zion Lowe would have been a very convincing choice there on the defensive line. Javon Bullard is a guy that would represent this program well, and that they picked Kamari Lassiter, I think, speaks to how highly the staff thinks of Kamari, and that's the guy. His story's been well documented before. Came in as one of the 4 non-early enrollees in that 2021 class, when the pandemic was still somewhat going on. And really, from the moment he stepped on campus, this has been a guy that has been ahead of the curve and has really been pushing and getting better all the time. And last year, stepped in as a starter for the first time and really didn't hear much from him. And if you're playing the cornerback position, that's what you're looking for. Opposing teams really would rather have gone after Keely Ringo than Kamari Lassiter. I at least find that a little bit interesting. And with him coming back this season, with Georgia clearly seeing him as one of the leaders of this program, look, there have been a lot of really talented corners that Georgia has had over the years, DeAndre Baker, Eric Stokes, Tyson Campbell, Keely Ringo. I think this Georgia staff thinks extremely highly of Lassiter and what he can bring to the table and what he means to this Georgia football team.
Yeah, we're on the same page about that. We're on the same page about Van Pran as well. On the topic of the Brock Bowers thing here for a moment, this is sort of what I want every SEC team to do. And if you're a media member from Georgia there to visit the entire SEC, there'll be media members from Arkansas there to do the same thing. We have a full kind of cross-section of our region who's going to be there in Nashville next week. And, I want Georgia to send Brock Bowers. I want Alabama to send Dallas Turner. I want, just pick whatever SEC team that you want. I want those guys sending their very best players. Now, I don't want to torture a guy that's shy and doesn't want to speak with the media at all, but when possible, to put the very best players in the league on the stage of SEC Media Days, to me, Connor, this is what this event's supposed to be for. And I think there is still a little bit of a disconnect, certainly nationally, maybe even regionally a little bit, with how good Brock Bowers actually is, because he does play on kind of an ensemble cast. Georgia has a lot of great players. Bowers' greatness, I believe, gets obscured. But when Georgia can give that a boost without, rocking team chemistry, things like that, but when Georgia can give Bowers a little bit of a notoriety boost, I think they ought to do it. And so from that standpoint, I'm really glad that he's going.
Yeah, not to bring some movies into this, but Brock Bowers, to me, he's a little like, an ensemble cast is a great word, I'm going to pull from it here. It's kind of like Leonardo DiCaprio in like The Departed or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where in both of those movies, there are guys that are doing louder performances and making more noise. And in that sense, like Brock, he's not a super, I'm going to tell it like it is. I'm going to be super confident and I'm going to be super arrogant in an interview. He is very down to earth. That's just sort of how he is. Unassuming, I think, would be a fair descriptor of him. But then, when the lights come on and it's time for him to do the thing and you sort of watch him work at his craft, you're kind of just blown away at just how good he is at what he does. And look, like Leonardo DiCaprio is probably the greatest actor of his generation, and I think Brock Bowers is certainly the greatest tight end of his generation. And when it's all said and done, not only do I think he can potentially be the best Georgia football player of his generation, but if Georgia wins a national title, as they are currently favored to do so, and he is the best player on this offense, which he has for the last 2 years, and I would expect him to be so again with this third team. I mean, this is a guy who, generational player gets thrown around quite a lot. Brock Bowers is hitting all the check marks to do that. And so I think you're largely right there in saying, this is a guy that at least, he's not super engaging and whatnot, and he's not the greatest interview in the world, and I don't want to hammer him on that. That doesn't make you a good player. It doesn't make you a good person. I think it's important for him to get his face out there and for people to sort of see and understand that, if Brock Bowers wasn't a football player, you probably just look at him and say, oh, yeah, he's a well-built, average 20-year-old. And I think that's what makes Brock so special is that he's not a super physical specimen. He's not like a Kyle Pitts type or like a Darnell Washington type. But then, he just sort of puts the pads on, and he is better than every single football player that he has stepped on the field with. And I think that speaks to his brilliance, and I think that's a big reason why more people need to get to know why Brock Bowers is the way that Brock Bowers is. I
don't want to belabor this point too much because there's other stuff to discuss, but think about this for next week just really, really quickly from a thought experiment standpoint. I think you and I both, and you take a little bit farther than I do, but I think you and I both have Brock Bowers on, like, say, the Mount Rushmore of Georgia football history here. I think he's the only player in the SEC currently that's on the Mount Rushmore for his program, so to speak, right? Like I think that he's the only current player in the SEC who can rightly be thought of to be one of the greatest players in that program's history. And so from that standpoint, I hope that Brock's going to hate it, but sometimes it's what needs to happen. I hope that Brock is treated that way next week as not just a good player on a great team right now, but a guy who actually sort of stands apart from almost any player that's come before him in program history in a way that I'm not quite so sure any other player in the SEC currently does.
Right, and I'd maybe even go a step farther and say I'm not sure there's a player in college football that has sort of the same credentials that Brock does. And part of this is it's the position that he plays, tight end. It is not, a running back, a quarterback, great defensive player, things along like that. It is usually a position where great transcendent players are few and far between. That's sort of the point of being a transcendent player. But I think when you consider, look, Georgia's been the best team in college football the last 2 years. Georgia's best offensive player the last 2 years has been Brock Bowers. And, like Jalen Carter's incredible. Jordan Davis had a sensational senior season at Georgia. From a statistical standpoint, Brock Bowers had a bigger impact than both of those guys did over the course of the season. And so, to your point there, I just think that, he doesn't have the mind-boggling numbers that, say, like a Marvin Harrison does because, again, Georgia gets up so big and they play a different way in the second half. But, if you actually, not to be like I actually watch football, but if you actually watch these Georgia games, and Georgia fans certainly know and understand this, like, if Georgia wanted to roll up the numbers, like Brock Bowers could get 2,000 yards in the season easily. I mean, he had 150 yards receiving one possession into the third quarter of the national championship game. This is a guy that can do it all. Georgia just chooses not to, and Brock, to his credit, doesn't demand to be used that way because he knows, as nice as those big round statistical numbers are, winning championships are what are far more important to him, and he's been able to do that and lead Georgia to two championships in the first two seasons. And, I'm working on a story on Brock, and I didn't want to give a whole lot away. But his seasons, both his freshman and sophomore seasons, have ended the exact same way. His final catch of the season has been a touchdown catch in the second half of the national championship game. That's just such a unique thing to have happen once, let alone twice in his career. And it speaks to sort of just how unique of a player and a person that Georgia has in Brock Bowers.
Shifting gears here a little bit, that's a really good point, Connor. That sounds like it's going to be a great story. And thank you for giving away some of it for free here on DawgNation Daily, first and foremost. We obviously appreciate that, of course. But shifting gears here just a little bit, we talked yesterday about the run of success that Georgia's had with its offensive line recruiting. I know you've written about this at DawgNation.com. I think a lot about this is fascinating. But first and foremost, Connor, I think that what Georgia did, keeping in mind the fact that last year there's only one team in the SEC that even signed four-star offensive linemen. The idea that Georgia got 4 commitments from guys like that over the span of about 9 days, to me, that run of success, given how much of a position of need that could be for Georgia on the field in 2024, Connor, I believe that's just as impressive as securing the commitment from Dylan Raiola. And when you look at how much the offensive line has played into the success that Georgia's had over the course of the last few years, I don't believe that can be undersold. The fact that Stacey Searles is just laying waste to his competition here right now, and I think he is rightly getting the credit for doing so.
Yeah, I think the big point you touch on there is that when you look at Kirby Smart's time at Georgia, the best teams have always had a great offensive line. The biggest difference from the 2016 team to the 2017 was just how much better that offensive line was in that 2017 season. Last year, they lose 8 guys to the NFL draft off that defense, an incredible 2021 defense. The reason some people out there think that 2022 team could theoretically beat the 2021 team was because of how good that offensive line was a season ago, where you have a guy like Amarius Mims, who I think is going to be a first-round draft pick when it's all said and done. That's a guy that's coming off the bench for you. And it speaks to sort of the way that Kirby Smart has always wanted Georgia to be built. And to your point on Stacey Searles, he's only continued to do that. And I think now as he gets deeper into his time here at Georgia, he's gone. This is his sort of second real recruiting class. We're starting to see a trend in terms of what he looks for and what he wants. And the reality is he just wants the biggest dudes possible. 247 updated some of their numbers, the weight numbers, after I had published my initial story on sort of the offensive line, and so I did some recalculating. As it stands right now with what the height and weight numbers are, this is the biggest, both in terms of height and in terms of weight, offensive line that Georgia will have ever brought in under Kirby Smart, and that's not a coincidence in my opinion. It's not a great year for offensive line talent in general from a recruiting standpoint. That's sort of what we've been told. And so Stacey Farrell has said, well, we still got to sign guys that are capable of playing here. And so the fact that they went bigger and went head-to-head quite a few times against Alabama, a few times against Texas, Michigan, Florida State, all wanted some of the guys that Georgia has gotten. I think it speaks to what Sarles has been able to do and what Georgia has been able to sell in terms of their offensive line. So those past successful offensive lines have absolutely, in my opinion, led to the recruiting success that Stacey Sarles has been able to bring in and continue in his time as the offensive line coach at Georgia.
Do you think that there's a similar streak set to come here on the defensive side of the ball? I guess we now have a commitment date for Williams Nwaneri. Looks like they're right at the beginning of August for him. Obviously, folks looking ahead to KJ Bolden there too. You think about Williams, the linebacker, who's obviously the teammate of Jonah Janye. How much of Georgia fans are obviously sort of building the anticipation that, okay, Georgia just cleaned house offensively along the offensive line. Now they're about to clean house defensively. How real and true do you think that can be?
As we sit here on today's July 11th, look, if they land all three of Justin Williams, the number one linebacker, KJ Bolden, number one safety, and Williams Narini, the number one defensive lineman, we're going to need to check on you. We're going to need to have people around you. I don't know how we're going to be able to contain you. Again, as impressive as this run was this past week, let's not forget, they also have the number one cornerback in the country in Ellis Robinson, and a guy who is every bit as good of a player. And quite frankly, I'm surprised, On Three, I guess, did the rankings update yesterday, and he's the number 11 overall player in the country per them, per the industry, sort of consensus. There are not 10 football players in the country better than Ellis Robinson, in my opinion. So when you add all that up, look, this was supposed to be a class that was focused on the offense and sort of what Georgia was going to bring in there. And Nathan Frazier is a guy that I'm very interested in seeing how his recruitment ends up and where he ultimately ends up going. That is, I think, maybe in my opinion now the most important guy left. But for a class that wasn't supposed to be so defensive focused, if they go out and sign Williams, Narini, KJ Bolden, Ellis Robinson, they already have Jonah Ajoye. At a certain point, we talk about how special that 2021 defense is. With what Georgia has signed in 2023 and what they signed potentially in 2024, we're getting close to a time where maybe Georgia has a 2021 defense every single year just with the type of recruiting talent that they bring in. And as much as college football continues to skew to an offensive first game, and it's sort of been that way for, at least a decade, maybe pushing on 15 years now, Georgia's going to be competitive, and if they keep getting the best defensive players, they're not going to lose a whole lot.
Let me finish with this. I talked about this to kick off the show here today. The fact that Ryan Day is still talking about Marvin Harrison Jr. and Javon Bullard and the Peach Bowl, and I think a lot of Georgia fans would characterize that as sort of whining. It has been, I think, a little bit weird for some Georgia fans to get used to how diminished some of the teams that I think Georgia fans would think is sort of a competition among equals, how diminished some of these programs are to the point where it almost seems like Ohio State's nostalgic about the fact they even kept it close against Georgia. And this is just sort of a weird place for UGA fans to be in, but in some respects, to me, Connor, it sort of demonstrates to the extent to which Georgia's laid waste to the rest of the sport. What do you make about the fact that, once again, Ryan Day, I don't know if you saw this, but he was interviewed by Joel Klatt, and, Klatt asked him about it, and Day was more than happy to go on a long, drawn-out answer about it. What do you make about the fact that, this is just sort of added to the litany of excuses that seems to exist for coaches after getting beaten by Georgia the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think Ryan Day knows how close he was to a national championship, and instead of using that as, quiet fuel for his team to sort of push them forward, he's maybe using it to say, hey, we should have won this. And look, Ryan Day's got some issues, in my opinion, in terms of he's lost 2 straight games to Michigan. I think if Michigan or Ohio State or, I don't know what the sports books say right now, but Michigan, if they're not a favorite, it's going to be close because the game is played in Ann Arbor this year. And Michigan is equally talented as Ohio State is, in my opinion, despite, Ohio State having better recruiting success. And so, I think, and you can maybe lump Nick Saban in there too, when you get that close to winning a national championship and you see that Georgia just very clearly isn't going to let up. You maybe do clutch a little bit closer onto those pearls in terms of, yeah, we could have had a national championship if things went our way. If Alabama's 2-star receivers didn't both tear their ACLs, if Ryan Day had been able to conduct a touchdown drive in the fourth quarter instead of only settling for a field goal there, and maybe have his defense get a stop in the fourth quarter there. So, I understand why those guys feel so close and feel like they were that close to a national championship and why maybe they're holding on to that. But, I don't remember Kirby Smart after, coming 3 plays away from winning a national title in 2017, sort of griping about that game and griping about, Tyler Simmons being on sides and whatnot. And so while fans certainly did that, and fans are to an extent always going to be different, fan is short for fanatic, and so I think that explains a lot of that there. When it's coming from a head coach, I think it tells me a little bit that they know that, like, Georgia, at least for the next couple of years, is going to be right there again and again and again. Sort of what Kirby Smart has done and what he came here wanting to do is always be in a position to keep winning and be in a spot to win titles. And so when you're there every year like Georgia is, you're maybe not quite as annoyed by some of this breaks not going your way, whereas if you're in Ohio State or you're in Alabama in their current, state of mind, when you come that close and you realize, hey, it might be 2-3 years before you get a chance to get another crack at this, maybe you do clutch onto those a little bit closer.
Yeah, I'll say this very quick because I've kept you long, but I think at some point in time, somebody really smart needs to go back and sort of reconsider those first couple of years for Kirby Smart, because I don't think there's any doubt that Smart, an 8-5 season in 2016, in 2017, the overall expectations for most people were not that high for Georgia, and yet Smart's demeanor back then, I think, laid the groundwork for the success they're enjoying right now. The phrase "act as if," Kirby Smart was very good at acting as if he already was an accomplished football coach, and acting as if Georgia already was a program on a equal stature with anybody else. And some of that behavior from Smart then was a part of the success they're enjoying now. And I think a lot of other kind of relatively newish coaches, I'll put Ryan Day in that category, I don't think they're nearly as good as the act as if part of this. Ryan Day just seems to behave in sort of a small way from time to time. I think a lot of the other coaches do too. I think Kirby Smart's way of putting himself on an equal footing with a coach like Nick Saban as quickly as he did, I don't think that's as easy as Kirby Smart made it look. Smart seemed to have some particular insight into the right kind of demeanor, even for a coach who had no experience, for a program in Georgia that had kind of been a little bit of an underachiever. Kirby Smart just sort of brought a different kind of demeanor there. And at some point in time, I do believe that needs to be reconsidered.
Right. I mean, I think you can even look at Billy Napier and sort of the way things are going for him at Florida right now. And we saw going into year 2, Florida's over-under is 5.5. Georgia, their second year under Kirby Smart, they were playing in the national championship game. And look, they both inherited different situations. But, the roster that Kirby Smart inherited from Mark Richt, I'm not going to say it was exactly similar to what Dan Mullen was, but Dan Mullen found success in Florida. And so I think, and the reality is, too, especially in a transfer portal era where flipping a roster is easier than ever, and you've seen teams get really aggressive in doing it. The whole no excuse mantra, Kirby has had that since day one. He was very upfront in that 2016 season that it was not good enough, losing to teams like Georgia Tech, losing to teams like Vanderbilt, and made it very clear that this was not the expectation. And to Kirby's credit, he figured it out. He figured out the changes and tweaks that needed to be made, and they weren't always popular or well received at the time. But when he's needed to make changes and adapt, he's done so, and he hasn't hesitated. After the 2019 season, I think a lot of people would have been willing to give James Coley a second season, just saying some of the things that happened that year were maybe beyond the control of that offense. But Kirby said, no, we're going to go out, we're going to bring in Todd Monken, and, that was a big move, especially given how good of a recruiter Coley was for the program at the time. And, that hiring of Todd Monken has really set, I think, a lot of things in motion for Georgia these last 2 years. And, look, when Monken was taking the Baltimore Ravens job, Kirby once again didn't hesitate. He brought Mike Bobo and elevated him to be the offensive coordinator. When things have moved around, he's been prepared. Had Will Muschamp in a place where he was ready to step in and help the staff when that opportunity arose. And Muschamp similarly has been a big boost to this program, in my opinion. Dan Lanning leaves to go be the head coach at Oregon, a very successful defensive coordinator for Georgia. Glenn Schumann simply steps up and keeps the machine going. And so I think that speaks to your larger point there, BA, about Kirby, having the right type of mindset to be in place when the opportunity is there. And Georgia's done that. It's a big reason why they've won 2 straight national championships and are positioned to potentially win a 3rd straight unprecedented national championship.
Connor, great stuff. We appreciate your time here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to reading some of that stuff that you said you had coming there at DawgNation.com. And, of course, talking to you back here on our program again very soon as well.
Yep, as always, it's a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So a quick point here just for a moment. I was looking this up while Connor was talking. So to begin the 2017 season, it's just so hard to kind of go back and kind of put yourself in the present tense back then. Georgia had been 8-5 the previous year. And let me tell you something. As bad as the 5 were, the 8 weren't all that pretty. There was a nice upset over a top 10 ranked Auburn, who was a 10-point favorite, double-digit favorite. I think it was 10 points coming into Athens that year. That was a nice win for Georgia. But some of those wins were like nickels down to the wire, and there were some, the 5 were pretty bad, the 5 losses. The 8 wins weren't all that much to brag about, back then either. It was not a very good season in 2016. Georgia, to begin the 2017 season, I looked at the preseason AP poll just to try to get a reminder of myself. They were 15th in the country to begin that year. A lot of what we do on this show during the offseason is we kind of become a little bit of a repository of sorts for like, hey, here's what people are saying about Georgia. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, and sometimes we kind of argue back and forth about who's getting their takes about Georgia wrong. I can promise you, summer of 2017, leading that 2017 season, that kind of content was pretty hard to produce because during that particular time, no one was really saying anything about Georgia at all. Georgia just was not that relevant of a team. Moving into Kirby Smart's second year after an 8-5 year the year before, Georgia was just not top of mind, tip of the tongue for most people who kind of talk college football. Now, back then, there weren't as many people talking the sport as there are now. But nonetheless, it was just one of those things where Georgia just wasn't that relevant of a program. And yet Kirby Smart was treating Georgia the same way then that he treats it now. And I do think from a leadership standpoint, that's probably worth revisiting at some point, is there's a very large vision being cast at that time. And when you see the way in which other coaches, and Connor mentioned Billy Napier, I mentioned Ryan Day and others, and it's not trying to be snarky because a lot of these guys may go on to eventually kind of find their own version of success. Some coaches succeed later. Dabo Swinney, it took him a while to become, truly successful at Clemson, but no one can dispute 2 national championships. There's several templates potentially for how you could potentially eventually become successful, but when you compare some of the newish coaches to Kirby Smart in his early days as UGA coach, there is a distinction about Kirby Smart that I think helps explain why he has been as successful as he has been. Now, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And we are excited about a lot when it comes to Royal Caribbean. I spent a little bit of time last night just thinking about Perfect Day Coco Cay. I was watching, some video stuff from Perfect Day Coco Cay because it's always one of my favorite things to do when I'm on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. And pretty much every search I begin for any kind of cruise vacation that I might take, when you think about future years or some of the ones I've taken over the course of the last couple of years, they, for me, always start with Perfect Day Coco Cay. It's the private island in the Bahamas, exclusive for those on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. And it's the thing to me that sets Royal Caribbean and its, kind of cruise lines apart from everything else that you might see kind of competing with that during the cruise industry. There's nothing like Perfect Day Coco Cay. So when it came time to think about our next DawgNation cruise, there was some discussion about what we might do. And I said, hey, let's make it bigger, let's make it better, but let's make sure we still go to Perfect Day Coco Cay. To me, you got to make sure that's a part of what you're doing there, and that's exactly what it's going to be. So when you think about April of 2024, you think about us being on board Allure of the Seas. You think about your opportunity now to be a part of that. In fact, can we show the DawgNation Cruise thing for folks just so they get a chance to make sure they see that if they're watching on video? Our good friend Jessica Slater wants to help you out with this. You can give her a call, but you can also go to the website that she's put together. It's royaldogs.com. We're going to be on board Allure of the Seas. Now, Allure of the Seas is a very special ship because it's one of the Oasis-class ships right now. That's the largest class of ships sailing, and Allure of the Seas makes the DawgNation Cruise for 2024 bigger and better than it's ever been. We've already had a tremendous response to this, and it's time for you to go ahead and book your DawgNation Cruise right now. We've got some cabins secured, some staterooms secured, and once those are gone, we have no more. So it's not too soon to start thinking about this. April 22nd through the 26th in 2024, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, Perfect Day Coco Cay, all kinds of incredibly themed Dog Nation events on one of the greatest, largest ships at sea, Allure of the Seas, leaving out of Port Canaveral. So go to royaldogs.com and find out more about that today. All right, a couple of recruiting notes here I want to get to as a part of our SEC through. Let me begin with Williams Nwaneri, who obviously is a name of note and has been that way for Georgia fans for quite some time. Another player that Georgia would like to add to this 2024 class. And there's discussion last week about Joseph Jonah Ajanye. There was some thought, could that be a little bit of a precursor for what might eventually go down with Williams Nwaneri? Well, Georgia fans had already been excited about that, and maybe now more excited about that after a recent bump that Nwaneri got in the recruiting rankings on 3, one of the recruiting services. And listen, I have a lot of friends that work for these recruiting services and all kinds of stuff like that. You could not pay me to do this job. I'm probably not qualified to do the job anyway, but you could not pay me to do this particular job of here's who's going to rank here and who's going to rank there. Fans lose their mind about all this kind of stuff. And listen, as I said before, I've got a lot of friends who kind of work in this industry, got great respect for them. It is always kind of amazing to me, though, that the best thing for your recruiting ranking sometimes would seem to be being an uncommitted prospect. You see Dylan Raiola, he has dropped in this recent on-3 re-rank. He's now only the number 11 player in their particular ranking here. Yeah, I kind of wondered out loud on the show, you've probably heard me say this before, would being committed eventually hurt Raiola's recruiting ranking? He's dropped down to a number 11 right now. He's no longer the top quarterback in the recent on-3 re-rank. Julian Sayin is up there right now. That's not quite how Georgia's recruiting board had this, but nonetheless, that's how on-3 has it for right now. But Nwaneri moving up to the top here of the ranking for on-3, which sort of gives you an idea. I believe that 24/7 Sports has reported that Williams Nwaneri going to make his commitment announcement coming up on August 1st. So right there at that same span of time that you'll hear from KJ Bolden the 5th, you may hear from Nwaneri a little bit just before that, and now ranked as the number 1 overall player in the country according to on-3. Of course, he hails from Missouri, and Missouri apparently is a big pursuer of him. Kind of reminds you of the Luther Burton recruitment from a couple of years ago. You sort of hope it doesn't have the same result ultimately for UGA, but this is a battle that Georgia seemingly is very much a part of, and now the stakes for this may have been raised a little bit more now that he is ranked, at least by one recruiting service, as the number 1 overall recruit in the country. So keep your eye on what goes down here with Georgia and Williams Nwaneri as you move towards all of that. So Georgia's going to try to make its big best attempt there in that big recruiting battle moving forward. Shifting gears to something else here for a moment. We'll come back to recruiting here in a minute. Did you see where Marco Wilson was on the Footballville podcast? We've referenced Footballville a couple times over the course of this offseason. Wilson's father is actually one of the hosts on Footballville, and Marco Wilson was a guest. Wilson, of course, famous for the guy that actually started what became the Golden Shoe here on our show because he threw the shoe in the game against LSU back in 2020. And there you go. So you see the Golden Shoe there on the shelf. The Golden Shoe came to be, and by the way, thank you for that, Michael. If you're watching a video, you see this, of course. The Golden Shoe came to be because of the Marco Wilson shoe throw. Well, Wilson said this week on Footballville that basically he had no regrets about throwing the shoe. If anything, he'd throw it even farther this time than he did last time. Which, on the one hand, I think Marco's kind of always been a pretty good sport by this. He obviously knows this is the kind of thing that people laugh about. And so he's been willing to kind of be laughed at for this. He's even laughed along at time to time about this. I think that Wilson's been a pretty good sport about all of this. But can you imagine being a Florida fan? And can you imagine a game that you lost to a team that you don't like very much in LSU, the Wilson shoe throw a big part of that? And yet all these years later, Wilson shows seemingly no remorse for that whatsoever. Like there's an element of me as a Gator hater that's amazed at sometimes how easy the Florida folks make it be to laugh at them for things like this. Marco Wilson led his example of that. Gators fans forced to gnash teeth over his unrepentant behavior. I think that's pretty funny stuff. We'll actually have a little bit of a revisiting of this topic for our Golden Shoe coming up in just a little bit. I think that's pretty terrific. On a more serious note, Northwestern has stepped up and fired Pat Fitzgerald, its coach, because of some reporting. Student newspaper, I guess, there in Evanston had this originally about the very extreme hazing that was alleged to have gone on with the Northwestern program. Originally, I should say, the punishment for Fitzgerald was supposed to be a 2-week suspension. but I guess this has got more national attention. The Northwestern leadership has now reconsidered that original idea, and now they've just flat out fired Fitzgerald. He says he's taking legal action here. Here's what I'm going to say about this. We talked about this yesterday. Like, if these facts are true as they've been presented, then it is horrible. It is heinous, and it scares you to the extent to which that, smart kids, good athletes, yet seem to be poorly developed from a character and integrity standpoint. That kind of scares you, and it kind of reminds you of the fact that's a really important thing that we need to make sure we still instill in, young, even successful young people, good students, good athletes, making sure they have good character there as well, because character is destiny. No matter, what kind of other credentials you might have, you'll only go as far as your character allows you to go. And if these facts, as they've been reported, are true, then obviously that speaks to some tremendous character deficiency on the part of otherwise successful young men. And that's serious, and that's, that's concerning. And yet it's also interesting to see the ways in which that some people seem to be a little skeptical of all of this. And, some of the people who've been a little skeptical of some of the Northwestern reporting are not always the favored, people on the internet, famous personalities who, certainly have their share of detractors, things like that. All I'll tell you is my antenna is up on this story. As it's been presented, very, 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 very disturbing. Disturbing facts, disturbing allegations, costing Pat Fitzgerald his job. A lot of people seem to, or at least a good portion of the people, even people close to the story, seem to be not quite so sure the way that the predominant narrative has emerged exactly reflects the facts on the ground. I'm not close enough to Evanston, Illinois to know. I'm also not that interested to care. This story is going to disappear from my field of vision in the next few weeks. But it is interesting to see that a very, kind of thorough investigation went into this. The original conclusion was, Fitzgerald needs the 2-week suspension. All of a sudden, more media attention on this, and now Fitzgerald's getting fired. My guess is we haven't heard the last of this. One way or another, we have not heard the last of what's gone on there at Northwestern, and I'll kind of leave that at that. But I will say this. Georgia fans sort of have a way of making anything be about UGA recruiting in some respects, and one of the things you may have seen, I believe it was Steve Wiltfong from 24/7 Sports who kind of tweeted this out, about the idea that Brian Hartline, the longtime wide receivers coach at Ohio State, and this is why Georgia fans care about it, and he's now kind of gotten the promotion. He's essentially offensive coordinator at Ohio State now, although Ryan Day's the play caller. Hartline's gotten the big promotion there. That maybe Hartline could be a candidate to become Northwestern head coach. Now I'm going to tell you right now, the reason why Georgia fans would be interested in that is because what's the thing that Jeff Santella said on our show over and over again every time he's joined us, that if Georgia were to truly get back in on Jeremiah Smith, who's thought to be one of the very best players in the entire country, 5-star wide receiver committed to Ohio State, the only way that Georgia would have a legit chance at Jeremiah Smith is if Brian Hartline left the Ohio State program. If he was gone, then maybe that might open the door for Jeremiah Smith. And so a lot of Georgia fans say, well, if Northwestern in the Big Ten has a job opening, maybe that's a job that Brian Hartline might take. Steve Wiltfong even kind of amplifying that as an idea. I'm going to be a wet blanket here for a moment. I don't think there's any way Brian Hartline would take the Northwestern job. I guess the online chatter is, the rumor mill would tell you that Hartline may have turned down the Cincinnati job here this year after Luke Fickell went to Wisconsin for big bucks. That's a program that's been in the college football playoff, that's moving into the Big 12. Cincinnati right now has a better job than Northwestern, two very different colleges, of course, but Cincinnati right now, from a program standpoint, is better than Northwestern, and Brian Hartline turned to that down. So if Hartline is at least speculatively turning down the Cincinnati job, and he's also probably likely to turn down the Northwestern job there as well, I think he has his eyes on something bigger. And I guess we'll wait and find out what that is. But I don't believe that Hartline's leaving for Northwestern. I do think someone will be interested in the Northwestern job because it is in the Big Ten. Fitzgerald had pretty good job security prior to this happening. You make decent money. You have decent job security. You are in one of the two leagues that matter more than the rest here right now. So someone of note is going to eventually want the Northwestern job, I believe, even with all the weirdness going on here right now. But I don't believe it's Brian Hartline. So for Georgia fans who are hoping this story might become a little bit of a inroad to potentially get back involved with a guy like Jeremiah Smith, I guess I sort of find myself in the position of being a wet blanket on all of that. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So if you want to see the way in which the Golden Shoe algorithm sometimes just hits me right between the eyes, This is an example of that. Georgia on Tap, one of the great people in the sort of DawgNation online community here, sends this, kind of combining two stories that definitely kind of get me. So here's the original story about Marco Wilson on the shoe throw, saying that he would 100% do it again. He'd probably throw it even farther this time. We'll correct the Florida grad here that correct grammar would be farther, not further when it comes to that. But nonetheless, we don't try to be too heavy-handed with the academic stuff. But nonetheless, Wilson says that he would throw it 100% farther this time. Georgia on Tap showing Pete Alonso after the game against the Braves of the day, where he said throw it again. Yeah, combining Alonso, the former Gator, with the lousy, stinking Gator Marco Wilson. Very good golden shoe there by Georgia on Tap. We will give that to him indeed. And by the way, speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, how about 109 days from right now? Georgia back in Jacksonville. No shoes will be thrown, but Pete Alonso will have a reason to cry again. By the way, got beat up in the home run derby last night. You love to see that. And you love to see Georgia beating Florida 109 days from now. We will see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. I've gotten a lot of good golden shoe submissions over the last few days. I'm kind of behind on some of those, but I had to let our buddy Georgia on Tap go to the front of the line on that. I'm pretty sure he knew he had me at hello when he was making fun of Pete Alonso and Marco Wilson within the confines of the same tweet. I'm pretty sure he was probably pretty pleased with himself after having done that. All right, let's go to Facebook first today. We'll talk there, and we'll just kind of bounce around here. We went very long yesterday. We may not go quite so long today, but hope you're doing good. On Facebook here for a moment. Alan Verbanchi, I was talking about imagine being a Florida fan. Alan says, I can never imagine being a Florida fan. You're right, Alan. That's a pretty perverse image for me to put into your mind, for sure. Kane Harris says, Hartline's not taking the Northwestern job, but we'll get the Ohio State job after this year's season when they don't win the national championship. So, Kane, that's kind of what I was alluding to before. Does Hartline think he's going to be the next Ohio State head coach? I mean, if you want to be like totally reckless and just completely speculate for a moment, which I guess I'm up for the task of doing, I believe the next Ohio State coach is probably more likely to be Luke Fickell. If I had to guess, I think they may go Fickell more so than Hartline. Because don't you think if Day fails, then to go, I mean, I don't want to say soft, but like, it seems like a lot of times with our presidents, like the one president sort of response to the previous president, you go back and look through history, it's like whatever you kind of think the polar opposite to be of the previous guy, that's what the next guy sort of feels like. Coaching hires are kind of that same way sometimes. If you've got the strict disciplinarian, you need to kind of have more of a player's coach. Player's coach fails, you're going to go back in the direction of disciplinarian again. It just sort of feels like coaches are a response to the previous guys oftentimes. And so if Day fails, don't you think they need to try to bring in a little bit more toughness to that job at that point in time? Doesn't that become a part of what needs to happen? So if I had to bet, I first of all, my bet would be that Ryan Day is not long for the Ohio State job, and that Brian Hartline would seem to be trying to position himself to get the job. But if I had to guess, my guess is he's going to be disappointed. And someone like Luke Fickell ends up getting that job. Fickell, who just left in Cincinnati to go to Wisconsin, I sort of see him potentially being in line for that. Now, I'm not really sure what Hartline's making right now, but, could he then get big bucks to actually be the offensive play caller for a future Ohio State program, which makes him the springboard to get, kind of major job that he might want? Maybe that's the case. But it does seem like Hartline, I mean, if you're turning down a job like Cincinnati right now, knowing that Fickell just used that job to get the big Wisconsin payday, if you're turning that job down right now, you've got your sights set on something. There's no doubt about that. And it could be every time that he walks into his boss's office, Ryan Day, that he's sort of in his mind rearranging all the furniture. But I don't quite know that that's the way that's going to go down. Eric Ray says, what's the confidence level on Winery? I would say the confidence level on Nwaneri for me is about the same as the confidence level that I'm actually pronouncing his name correctly, which is not very high. And I don't mean to disrespect Mr. Nwaneri when I do that. To me, this sort of feels coin flippish, I guess. I mean, there is only – this is what you sort of see, I think, in the modern time of recruiting. I told you this the other day. It's like randomly Coleman, the 5-star receiver, committed to Texas A&M. Now, Texas A&M is a good recruiting power, and a couple of years ago they had the number 1 class. But they haven't really been heard from since then, right? And just out of nowhere, randomly, Cam Coleman committed. You also seem like you have a lot of sort of one-off type deals going on here where the only way that Missouri could be a true factor with Georgia on this situation, it's got to be strictly NIL. And in a case like Missouri, you see this with Luther Burden. And once again, this is just sort of wild speculation, but that's just kind of what we're doing here right now. Missouri does not have enough money to pay an entire team, but can they throw all their eggs in the basket of keeping Luther Burden? Apparently they could. He's still there, at least for this year. So when it comes to recruiting, Missouri can't spend enough to get even a decent recruiting class. But can they spend enough when they have the very rare 5-star in the state of Missouri? Can they spend enough to win this one recruiting battle? It seems like they probably could. And it seems like you see a lot of these sort of weird one-offs where out of nowhere, so-and-so commits this one place because they had just enough money for the one big player. And it's probably better in their mind to have the one big player than it is to have, 5 smaller players or something like that. And so that's what's going to go down. So this would appear to be Georgia selling what Georgia sells, with Missouri seeing a big NIL opportunity with a rare in-state elite prospect. And, your guess is as good as mine in terms of which of those two options ultimately went out. I would say that either is likely. Oklahoma, are they also a factor in this too? It is kind of interesting to see. For a long time, Oklahoma wasn't really in play for any major defensive recruit, going back to the time when Lincoln Riley was coach there. But they were silver medalist for Joseph Jonah Ajonye the other day. Decent factor here in the Williams Nwaneri recruitment. Pretty clearly Brent Venables is trying to put his stamp on that side of the ball. I just think it's kind of interesting. This doesn't have much to do with Georgia. But I think it's kind of interesting that clearly Brent Venables is trying to do something there, trying to be a factor for some of these kind of defensive players. He obviously had success with the defensive players he was able to recruit at Clemson. He's trying to sell that there at Oklahoma. So I would certainly not put it past Georgia to win this thing. There's a very good chance they might. But when you talk about a situation where, I said this the other day, Eli Drinkwitz, I believe, is the most likely SEC coach to get fired. So if he can do something to gain a little bit more, favor with his own fans, winning a 5-star in your own state may be as good an example of that as possible. So, Tigers probably kind of pull out all the stops here. But even with all of that, there's still stories told, around the campfire about, how the Luther Burden thing all played out. So who knows? Alan Rabanchik says Ohio State needs to hire Dan Mullen. Then they would have Blackbeard and Darth Vader at media day. I kind of like Blackbeard as a nickname for Ryan Day. That's really funny. Ooh, Philip Jordan Wells. This is a really good one. He says that Ohio State's the Anna Kournikova of college football. I kind of like that. Now, that's probably more of a compliment than I want to give the Buckeyes. Obviously, if you're of a certain age, 1990s era Anna Kournikova sort of ranks as a pretty rare air in terms of certain things. But Philip Jordan Wells is a really good point. Really, really famous, very little in the way of accomplishment. Sort of seems like it probably should be better than it is. Philip, that's a pretty good one. That is a pretty good one, I have to admit. All right, let's go to the YouTube side of things here for a moment. It's kind of funny, my wife's parents, a lot of you know this, both her mother and father have passed away in the last few months, and we're kind of in the process right now. This is one of those things that just sort of life requires you to do. We've had to, we're cleaning out their house, and they live in the same house for more than 30 years. There's a lot of storage, and so the storage just gets filled up, and so we're in the process of kind of cleaning all this out, moving things out of this house. And so, we've been doing this now for quite some time. And it's kind of funny. Like, a lot of this stuff is from the 90s, which is when my wife and I were both in high school and, things like that. And so, it's like I've had the 90s on my mind a lot. So it's kind of funny to go back to like Anna Kournikova and stuff like that. It just sort of feels like that's been kind of on my mind. That decade is sort of all, been on my mind just a lot lately, just because in the process of going back and seeing these artifacts from the 1990s. Anna Kournikova, certainly a cherished childhood memory for sure. Let's see what else. Andrew Hughes says, can you help me with this stat? When was the last time a team sat their starting quarterback the entire fourth quarter because the scoreboard had become deplorable in a national title? Yeah, I'm guessing that hasn't happened very much, right? I mean, I think that Georgia is almost, I think it was the second most. I think it was the second most. The second biggest blowout in bowl history, not just national championship history, but bowl game history. I mean, I still don't think we talk enough, Andrew, about the fact that Georgia won a national championship game 65-7. That's sort of a made-up score. That's almost like 65 is just sort of a weird point total anyway. But 65-7 is just sort of a made-up score. We don't talk enough about that probably. But it's a really good question. Nick Talent wonders if Bobo is going to bring back the fullback position. I don't think that Georgia's ever going to use a scholarship to bring in a fullback, but could they have a fullback in the game from time to time? I think that's certainly a possibility. Goal line situation, things like that. Frank Patterson says, I can't remember one interview where Kirby brought up Big O getting hurt and leaving the game. Yeah, Frank, I think that's a really good point. It's kind of what I was sort of touching on with Kirby a little earlier. Kirby Smart is very well aware of sort of power dynamics, and Kirby does not do a lot to intentionally diminish himself. And whining about injuries just diminishes you. Nick Saban's not a very big guy, but I want you to notice this. Watch this when this happens. When Nick Saban starts talking about injuries, doesn't it seem like he just sort of gets smaller? He's a short guy already, but shoulders are hunched down. He kind of sits down like this, and he's talking about this. Like, it just sort of seems like Saban just visually gets smaller when he starts talking about, wide receiver injuries, things like that, that it just makes a small person even smaller, small in stature, of course. A small person seems smaller because that's just not what a big, respected leader is supposed to do. And I think much the same way with Ryan Day. Like, everything about Day that we don't like, at least to me, comes rushing to the forefront when this guy's still complaining about an officiating call that went against him. And replay demonstrates it rightly so. And Day's response to that is, instead of admitting, well, I guess maybe I ought to move on, Day's response is to criticize the replay. That's just, once again, I don't want to be preachy. But if I were going to be preachy, I'd preach about this. That when replay doesn't validate Day's feelings, Day then decides he doesn't like replay, which is just to me very, very interesting. And, the stuff that we sort of notice about Ryan Day from time to time, our commenter on, was it Alan who called him Blackbeard? The what seems to be slightly unnatural hair color in the beard, or lack of other accomplishments. All that stuff just seems to be a lot more apparent with Day when he's whining about something that happened to him. I think that's a really good point. G. Grace says, Saban can never look small. He's the king of college football. His words are front page news and always blow up Twitter. Except when he's like this, you just get, look and see. Go back and watch some of the video of him complaining about the injuries, the rebuilding year. Look how it's almost like he just keeps shrinking as he says that. Nature Gator says Day and his staff coached a great game against UGA. Well, I'll tell you this, Nature. They certainly helped him at the end of the game, taking foot off the gas, essentially settling for a 50-yard field goal. That was a series of coaching decisions that certainly helped Georgia, for sure. Jonathan Aaron says, take a page out of Ryan Day's playbook. If you don't like the call, you got to double down on it. Yeah, I mean, clearly, Ryan Day more than happy to do that. Let's see what else. MG says it really seems like UGA is on an entire different level than every other team. He says, at this rate, I wouldn't be surprised if we have 5 more by 2030. This NIL portal era really separated Georgia from everyone else. Yeah, I mean, it is certainly possible that the expanded playoff is actually going to benefit. The expanded playoff is going to benefit someone. Right now, it seems like that Georgia is the most likely to benefit from that. I mean, the stat that I pointed out before, in the FCS level, where they've had an expanded playoff for a lot longer than we've had it here at this level, North Dakota State's won 9 of the last 12 national championships. There is an established proof of concept that the more rigorous postseason at the college football ranks only serves to more greatly identify the best team. Now, if you expanded it beyond that, there is a point in which that would become less true. You know, if you want to go back, do you guys know the movie Rounders? It's a movie that I like, once again, from the 90s. I'm clearly 90s obsessed right now. But Matt Damon in that movie says something to the effect of making the case for poker not being luck, being about skill. He says something to the effect of, why do you think the same small handful of players end up at the final table at the World Series of Poker each and every year? And when Damon said that was true. When his character said that was true. But years later, the poker craze kind of happened. You know, Chris Moneymaker, kind of an amateur, won the World Series of Poker. Well, after that, 8 gazillion people joined the World Series every year, and the idea of the same people being in the final table every year, that no longer was true anymore. There was a lot more randomness entered into the World Series of Poker equation because there were just more people playing in it. If college football put every team in the college football playoff, that would actually hurt Georgia's chances of winning. In other words, if it was a 120 team bracket or something like that, odds are Georgia would eventually lose because the odds are everybody would lose. This becomes a little bit more like the lottery at that point in time. It becomes a little bit more random. But at the lower end, to go from a 4-team playoff to a 12-team playoff, that actually takes a little bit of randomness out of it. All of a sudden now, it's harder to win the national championship. And when it's harder, that's better for the best teams. So someone is going to benefit from the expanded playoff, and someone will probably go on a run where they do win more championships. Right now, it does seem like it's positioned to be Georgia. So if Georgia enters the 12-team playoff world at the same level they're kind of thought to be right now, then they really only may be just getting started. And as crazy as that sounds, as I said before, there is evidence to support in college football it could be true. But one way or another, someone is going to win a lot of championships in a 12-team playoff. It's not going to be Wisconsin won it this year and Ole Miss won it that year and Virginia Tech won it. That's not what the 12-team playoff is going to be. It's going to be even greater concentration, I believe, even greater concentration of success for the very best teams in college football. That's going to happen. Frank Patterson says, have you seen the rumors that Will Muschamp's name is in the mix for the Northwestern job? I mean, I guess anything is possible, but I'm guessing Will Muschamp is happier right now than he has ever been. If you ever see Will around campus or, on the sidelines, I mean, he looks like he's living his best life. I do believe that Muschamp will probably be a head coach again at some point in time. I do believe that's the case. And I did say before, I think someone is going to want the Northwestern job. I don't think it's a toxic job that no one's going to want because it is in the Big Ten. You can coach there for a long time. It's the kind of job that coaches probably like. I don't believe that Will Muschamp will be one of those coaches. I don't really know what his next head coaching stop would be. My guess is it's probably still a few years away because, I mean, he's got one son that's still in high school. His other son's on campus with him here right now. He's working with his good friend. He's making, I think, good money, right? At one point in time, I don't think money was much of an issue because he was, still getting paid big bucks from South Carolina. I'm guessing that Will Muschamp's probably pretty happy doing what he's doing. Eventually, he'll probably want to be a head coach again, maybe, but I think Will's one of those guys that sort of has the been there, done that look on his face. He's like, listen, I've taken the slings and arrows. I've been kicked around by South Carolina fans and Florida fans, and I think he's kind of happy right now to spend time around friends, spend time around ball. I mean, a lot of my friends are high school coaches. Like the one thing they'll always say is that when they get a chance to no longer be a head coach and like spend like the last years of their career, like just being an assistant coach again, they love to do that because they love being around ball, as they like to say. They like being around the game. They just they don't always love the parents. They don't necessarily love the administration in some cases. There's a lot of things that complicate being a coach. But being out there on a sunny day at practice, teaching the game, I mean, for true coaches, it don't get any better than that. And so I think that Will Muschamp is probably in his, sort of phase of life where, he's been the face of a program before, but now he gets a chance just to be around friends and family and just get knee deep into the sport. I'm guessing he's probably pretty happy. Reggie Fly says, do you think that Schumann and Hartline are waiting for that Texas A&M job, given how much money they have? Yeah, I mean, I think that when Glenn Schumann leaves Georgia, it's going to be for a pretty good job. And I think when Brian Hartline leaves Ohio State, he's only leaving for a pretty good job. So is that an example of a job that might be there? For sure. Yeah, so somebody mentioned Will Son. So Jackson is on the Georgia roster, I think, still, right, as a walk-on quarterback. But he's got another son who's a quarterback at Baylor. I think he's still there, right? Baylor in Chattanooga. So he's got another son who's still in high school. And he may have more than that. That's just the two that I happen to be aware of. Kenny Mack says Athens is the best college town with the best fans and best team. Why would Muschamp leave? Well, I mean, like, people are upwardly mobile. And, I mean, there are a lot of coaches at Georgia, I'm sure, that love Athens, love the fans, love everything else too. But there's just sort of that inner drive to keep conquering new worlds, for better or worse. A lot of men seem to have that thing of, hey, I got to go find some new world to conquer. And so, for a lot of, especially the younger coach in the Georgia staff, I'm sure they're like, I love it in Athens, but I want to build my own Athens somewhere else. And eventually they're going to get their chance to probably do that. In the case of Will Muschamp, I'm guessing he probably has the ability to sort of quiet that part of his brain for right now, that part of his soul. My guess is he probably has the ability to sort of, kind of quiet that down because he's like, listen, I've been there and I've done that. And maybe at some point in time, I'll need to do that again, take on a new challenge again. But for now, I'm just going to enjoy the sport. I'm just going to enjoy my friends, enjoy my family. Like, can you imagine? I mean, like, Kirby and Muschamp and Bobo are legitimately friends. This is not. Sometimes we do this thing so we sort of exaggerate sports friendships. My understanding is they are legitimately friends. Like, truly, they enjoy spending time around each other. Can you imagine how much fun it would be to do a job with your true friend? Like, not to say you don't make friends with people you work with, but like, what if you and your like best friends from college all did the same job together? Can you imagine how much fun that'd be? This is probably a pretty special time in their lives, I'm guessing, and I'm all for it. I mean, if you want Kirby to be at Georgia for 25 years, you have got to bank some easy years for him. Kirby is just sort of a burn the candle at both ends type guy. And bright fires burn out fast. And you better believe the idea of, Kirby one day trying to figure out how do you preserve some of the energy that seems to be balanced for him right now, that one day might be a thing. Well, the way in which you get some of this to last a little longer, the way you would preserve some of that longevity is you bank a few easy years along the way. And we may look back, or I'm guessing maybe Kirby and Mike and Will maybe one day back and look and say, oh, this was actually the most fun time of my professional life. We were all there together, all there doing kind of the same task, clearly successful, which is, a part of this too. This may be a really fun time in their lives. I don't know that. I'm just guessing, but I'm guessing that might be true. Let us see what else. Andrew Hughes says, crying day Blackbeard thinks we can land people on the sun if it's nighttime. Blackbeard's comments are more wide left than the miracle at midnight. I like that. And I do think the Blackbeard nickname may have some legs for him. I do. G. Grace Bama Boy says, stay in your lane. Muschamp is a DC. He is not a head coach, in my opinion. So I've said this before. I truly believe, and I said this when Muschamp was coaching other places, I truly believe a lot of what has happened to Will over the course of his college career has mostly just been a product of bad luck. I do. And the South Carolina thing and the Florida thing, similar issues kind of tripped him up in both places. They just didn't have the offense figured out. That's just true. I think a lot of that's just bad luck, right? It's like if you stumble into the right offensive coordinator, if you stumble into the right quarterback, then everything sort of feels different. And I do think that Kirby Smart was very careful about his own journey there on that. Defensive-minded guy. Let me make sure I've got my right offense in place. Let me take the quarterback position seriously. And Kirby Smart was very careful with those decisions because those decisions could have tripped him up too. Ultimately, they didn't. But, in a different set of circumstances, I think that Will Muschamp could absolutely still be a successful head coach. I do. If that's what he wants to do, I think he could be. I mean, to me, when Muschamp, talks, we see him a couple of times these press conferences, I still think he looks like a head coach. I mean, I do know what G. Gray says. There are some people that just sort of look like assistants. They just sort of do. They look like back of the house type guys, like the Austin Armstrong guy that Florida just hired as defensive coordinator. To me, that looks like an assistant coach. Maybe one day he'll own the sport. Maybe one of these days he'll be, because he's still a relatively young guy, but he just sort of looks like an assistant. Some of the grotesque stuff he's been seen doing on the sidelines, spring game, things like that. This guy just sort of looks like an assistant. By comparison, I think that Muschamp, to me, after having been a head coach, kind of presents himself like a head coach. Looks good in the golf shirt. Kind of looks good in that. I think he kind of comes across. To me, he still looks like a head coach. There are people who look like assistants. I think Muschamp sort of looks like a head coach. Rob says that Muschamp was the head coach in waiting in Texas at one point in time. That's right. Back kind of when you had that. He had a chance. It's kind of funny. All the head coaches in waiting, like how many of them actually ever became head coach at that particular spot? Because there was a time in which that was a thing. Jimbo did become head coach at Florida State after being head coach in waiting. Did anybody else do that? Like at one point in time, James Franklin was head coach in waiting at Maryland. That didn't happen. Muschamp was head coach in waiting at Texas. That didn't happen. And the reason why you don't do head coach in waiting anymore is because I guess the NCAA changed a rule so that head coach in waiting had the same recruiting restrictions as the actual head coach did. Head coaches have limited contact. And so I guess the NCAA changed the rule so that the head coach in waiting was also limited in contact to recruits. So programs said, we're not going to do this anymore because we don't have any incentive to do so. But back in the head coach in waiting era, most of those head coaches in waiting never actually became the head coach of the program they're waiting on. Let's see what else. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. I haven't been there yet. At least during this portion of our conversation. Then after that, we're going to go. All right, back in here in our DawgNation comment section. Then after that, we got to get ready to go. Kent Holcomb says, I can see the continued use of a big defensive lineman at fullback and goal line fourth and short situations like Monk did with Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter. Yeah, maybe some of that. I could also, and I'm actually not against that kind of thing. I think that some of those personnel packages can be pretty hard to defend against. Let's see what else. Senior Dog 54 says, if I'm Ohio State, Ryan Day is my coach. He's won big, although a national title has eluded him, but he's proven winning coach. Yeah, Senior Dog, I guess I sort of feel a little bit differently on that. I think if you're Ohio State, there's no excuse for losing, several years in a row to Michigan. Now, he's only been 2 in a row here. So I think this year's going to be pretty telling on that. But I think if you're the Ohio State coach and you lose 3 years in a row to Michigan, that's going to create some questions about your program. Because keep in mind, the recent playoff appearance for the team in 2020 came in the pandemic in a year in which, Kevin Warren completely messed up the entire, landscape of that conference. And Ohio State did not play Michigan. So it's interesting to note that, we saw in 2020, Ohio State, big game from Justin Fields. They beat Clemson. They made the national championship game. But that playoff berth in large measure was produced because they didn't have to play Michigan in that particular season. And so in the last 2 years, even though they've had the better recruiting classes, they've been the point spread favorite. They've still lost, and they've lost pretty convincingly. So this is the kind of conversation we sometimes have. We don't really have a lot of skin in this game, you or me, either one. But from this standpoint, I sort of side with the Ohio State fans a little bit if they were to say, in a place like Ohio State, you're actually hired to do more than this. For instance, Kirk Herbstreit's been critical of Ohio State fans and kind of treats them as if they're crazy for not being satisfied with the level of winning they've been having. But once again, when you're one of these big-time power programs, you have a lot of wins kind of baked into your schedule from the very beginning. You pay non-conference teams to come to your stadium and essentially lose for money. Some of your conference foes don't even play at the same level as you are. If you're a team like Ohio State, you sort of begin a year with 6 wins. About like on paper to begin the year, you've already kind of rubber-stamped at least 6, if not 7 or 8. And it's what you do in the other games that tell the entire story. And then there's usually like one game that really matters more than anything else. And that's why, the coaches get paid the huge dollars, because they are measured in a very narrow way in terms of the definition of success. So I get your point, but I do have to say I kind of side with Buckeyes fans on that a little bit. Randy Hall says we need a full montage of nicknames for all the SEC coaches, like Sling Blade for Billy Napier or Blackbeard for Ryan Day. Yeah, it's not bad. I like that. Senior Dog says people wanted Harbaugh fired for not being able to beat Ohio State. Now the tables have turned. He says, I bet they're glad they hung on to him now. Same with Day. You are right about that. That sometimes impatience seems silly after the fact because, when Jim Harbaugh first came in 2016, he was the talk of college football. They underachieved for a little bit, and now he's really built that program into something really pretty impressive. I mean, south of losing to Georgia, they're kind of taking care of everything else around college football right now. So the patience paid off. And maybe some patience with Ryan Day will pay off too. I think one of the things that we probably agree on, though, is that eventually the standard is success. Harbaugh, couldn't have kept on coaching forever without beating Ohio State. He just kept on long enough until he finally did. Same thing for Ryan Day. It's like, we may see them beat Michigan this year. They may win the Big Ten this year and kind of sort of, change the dynamic of that rivalry a little bit. But you can't coach forever without beating the team that probably matters most in your schedule. I think that's a fair point. I do. It's a really good comparison. Patience has definitely paid off for Michigan fans when it comes to Harbaugh. Rob says only way the Dogs don't three-peat is if they get complacent and Kirby has too many kids fighting for a starting spot for that to happen. Yeah, there's a certain competitive nature to the roster and the practices that probably fight back against that complacency, Rob. I think you probably bring up a pretty good point. Christy, good to see you here. Thanks for checking out. Paul Moon makes an interesting point here. He says, if I had to guess, Florida's offense this year, less explosive but more consistent with Graham Mertz. He was a highly recruited guy for a reason. That's an interesting appraisal of that situation. Final comments over here on Facebook. Alan Verbanchik says Muschamp seems to be loving winning titles with Kirby. I believe that's the case. I also think he's just enjoying. I mean, look, defensive coordinator at a place like Georgia is a breakneck pace, but it's a little bit different kind of pace than sometimes being a head coach is, especially when you're kind of a head coach sort of fighting for your job. It's sort of a middle-tier SEC team. So my guess is there's probably a lot of what's going on there that he likes. Becky Rutledge says Ohio State fans have actually blamed Day's play calling for some of their losses, which is an interesting point, Becky. I appreciate you sharing that into our conversation. All right, anything else before we go? April Van Giesen, I hope I pronounced that correctly, April, says she goes, I hope this is not true, but Glenn Schumann to Alabama makes a lot of sense. I mean, look, I think that Glenn Schumann has a very bright future as a head coach. Alabama's obviously his alma mater. You wouldn't fault him if he had dreams and aspirations of being a head coach at Alabama. But hopefully Georgia's able to hold on to him for quite some time to come. And just given the fact that Georgia continues to recruit inside linebackers as well as it has, and that would lead you to believe from sort of a context clue standpoint that they must have some belief that Schumann's going to be here for a little while. All right, we have got to go. Thank you all for being here. Y'all check out R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that today, including hot times right now, getting your air conditioning tuned back to factory fresh specs. Trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.